And it can be quite a profound thing in yoga if you start to work with the body in a way where you slowly learn how to lose the unconscious tensions in your body. It's like you're dropping a history away, and you can feel a bit bewildered.
Yeah.
You know, it can feel bewildering.
I'm here with Pete Blackaby, and I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. Pete and I have known each other a really long time. We haven't probably seen each other, or I've not worked with Pete for a long time. But for me, it's been important to kind of do these series of interviews and include Pete, because if it wasn't for Pete, I wouldn't be doing what I do, actually, because we met. Actually, I met you on a shiatsu training where you came and taught a day of anatomy.
Yeah, probably.
That's how it started.
Yeah.
You were just talking a particular way. I think to me in that time, it was the way that you were speaking about the body at that time. And even though, from what I remember, you were going through various changes from your yoga practice to what you were heading towards at that time. And I think a lot of discovery might have been happening for you, but for me, it just reminded me of the way my father used to talk about things. And it was back into this place of looking at things left of field slightly from my perspective. Yes, it just changed the course of everything that I did at that particular time. And Pete's well known for his book, Intelligent Yoga, which I'll tell you what, Pete, when this first came out, it was amazing to see your book come out because it was long overdue. But of course, it was the right timing for you. But it was a book that, if anyone was going to write a book that encompassed the quality of this work and I think the individual nature of this work per person, you know, the person that I saw that was doing that so beautifully and eloquently was yourself. So welcome, Pete.
Well, that's a big introduction. Thank you, Gary.
Okay.
Yeah, that must have been nearly 30 years ago.
I think so. Yeah,
you had that little studio in John Street or something, was it?
Yeah, it was an old garage that was turned into a gym with a concrete floor with a bit of carpet over the top of it.
Yeah, a couple of barbells.
Yes, that's right. I remember that well. But it was such a profound time because I think for all of us, I think we're all going through levels of exploration and change. You know, Liz Warrington, Neville, Lisa McRory, who's on the cover of your book.
Yeah.
And I think there was Faye was with us and Nikki Dunford sometimes and
Rose.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it was quite a profound time, I think. You know, there was a lot of self-exploration that was going on through that.
Yeah, I think these were there were interesting times in the sense that I think there was a kind of change of perspective. John Sturt was obviously quite influential at the time for me because he'd been you know, his view is always left field. You know, he's a good man for seeing the world through another lens, and you know, that's how I always like to learn. And he introduced me to ideas and concepts that I hadn't previously thought about. And he stood out as a lecturer just by being deeply interesting, and you know, seeing past. I don't know, seeing past the ordinary somehow. He was very good at seeing past the ordinary. And I think in those days, it was things like fascia that had sparked me off. You know, he was talking about fascia. I'd never heard really about it. And there was this whole, you know, the Ida Rolf stuff. He introduced me to Tom Myers, and that was a really interesting change in perception from the kind of anatomy you studied in books. And as an osteopath, it was all very separated, you know, cardiovascular systems. And John was very useful in helping us put it all together. and start thinking about how we are all joined up. And I guess once you start getting on that journey of inquiring into how we are as human beings, in a non-booky way, it's endless, isn't it? You start, and that started me off on my own kind of journey, and I've ended up much less interested in anatomy. Actually, I've moved in the other direction, and become much more interested in how human beings respond to the world. As a process of, I suppose, there are two or three things that contributed to that perception. One is, as an osteopath, you work with people with pain. You start off, you're taught that, in the idiom, the issues are in the tissues. So you're always trying to resolve people's problems by dealing with the tissues. But it took me an inordinate amount of time to really realize that if you hurt yourself, it heals. So you cut yourself, it heals. You break a bone, it heals. You pull a tendon, it heals. And then the pain goes away. Now, if the pain doesn't go away, but the body's healed, the issue can't be in the tissues. It's in somewhere else. And if it doesn't heal, then you've got to try and find out why it's not healing. But it's very rarely something you can do to a tissue and change a tissue that will make that person better. And that became an interesting, well, what is it then? Why are people in pain? And that became an interesting question. And it seemed, or the answers that, or the other questions that came up were, if it's not in the tissues, it must be in the way we perceive ourselves, in perception. So perception became the thing I became interested in. How do we perceive things? How do we granulate our perceptions? How do we notice and respond to things? How do we get caught up in our histories and respond in predictable ways? That became the kind of interest. That's probably the trajectory I'm still on.
Yeah, because I've watched it from afar in a way, because I'm not in your classes anymore purely because my life has just gone in a certain direction.
Well, that's how it should be. We form our.
It's lovely to because we come across the same students every now and again, and people talk about where their practice is at and who they've been working with, and it's been lovely and a beautiful journey to watch you travel in the way that you've been going. And I think also your influence from Feldenkrais, I think, has had some sort of impact. If I'm
married to a Feldenkrais teacher, you cannot be. Well, it's not just that. It's just he was a very bright man. He had a lot of very interesting ideas very early on that I think were ahead of his time, to be honest. But not just him, of course, Faravelli, important. For me, Serge Krakowski was important.
Yes.
All these kind of people, and in terms of the nervous system, people like Antonio Damasio, who I've never met, but I've read a lot of him. All creating a kind of other questions. All these people look at human beings in different ways that aren't perhaps conventional, but have a lot of common sense behind them. What I liked about Krakowski when I first met him was his complete lack of history in exercise, or he's not an exercise man, he's not a therapist, he doesn't know anything about it, so he came with a very fresh view and just sort of saw a lot of the holy cows that we have in our world that he just saw as daft, and kind of called them out. And everyone was going, "Ooh, you can't say it." Took on some of the big figures, and I don't know, just with very common sense arguments, said it just doesn't work like that, and wrote a book about it.
Yeah.
And that was kind of refreshing. You know, you just saw past a lot of the nonsense.
Interesting, isn't it? Because it can, and I know I've done this, many times, is that can be so wrapped up in our own thing, practice, that we forget to stop and look outside of it and question it from within.
Yeah, yeah, you do. I mean, it is. I think one of the hardest things to do is to think outside your own paradigm, your own, your own world that you've invested so much time and energy in, and however much you question stuff. I think this is a big question for the world at the moment. How do you think outside your own cultural beliefs, your own teachings, your own, it took me probably 20 years to realize that most of what I was taught as an osteopath was wrong. But you kind of, you're so invested in it, and you're so surrounded by it, you can't believe it could be wrong. And then someone like Blackaby comes along, or I don't know, few other people who just point out the flaws in the thinking. The pain science people, I think that they've been a big influence on me. Some of the, the studies on people with chronic pain, the studies on people with somatoform disorders, how the sensory nervous system can trick us into believing one thing when actually another thing is happening. So the fallibility of our own nervous system is really interesting. That you can't trust your senses, not always, and yet they're the things we have relied on through millennia to survive. But it's a kind of faulty mechanism.
I do something with, as you know, I'm trained in cranial work as well, and we the 20p piece is the 5 grams of pressure that at least you're training to understand what that would feel like. So I have my students put a 20p piece on their right hand in the center, and then the same 20p piece in that hand, and it feels much heavier on that one. How do I know what 5 grams weighs?
Yeah.
This guy will tell me what 5 grams is, but my right hand tells me something different to my left hand.
Yeah.
So what happens when we're moving through space and going through practice?
Yeah.
What's going on then? So
yeah.
You almost have to question our own nervous system in that respect.
Well, it's true. It's the only thing we've got to depend on, but to recognize its fallibility and to keep on testing it and keep on examining it seems to me at the moment seems to me the way you improve any kind of function of life, any interaction with life. And that so if you start thinking of yourself as a kind of neurological creature, well, we are, you don't have to think of yourself like that, we are neurological creatures, but if you think of neurological outflow landing either in muscles as behaviors, or the way we hold our tensions in our muscles, that gets very visibly observed. You can see the outflow, the response of a person's the response of a person to life is expressed in the way you can see it in their bodies, but you can also see it in their behaviors. How do they behave? What do they do? What are their emotional responses? These are just outflows of neurological that either end up in muscular or behavioral repertoires. And so if you want to change in any more useful way, it seems at the moment to me that's what you've got to address. The structure is what we address it through.
That's interesting to say that because we're moving soon. I've been going through lots of stuff here, and I found a couple of CDs that are of cine films that my cousin put together of all the cine films from our families. Yeah. So all there is me as a baby and a young child growing up, and it's all the stuff like the 1960s and 70s cine films of kids in the gardens and stuff like that. But there was some moments that I remembered.
Yeah.
I recognized how I felt, and I could see it in my posture, and of course my face, because as a kid they're very expressive, and sometimes I was a really grumpy little git. I could see it right there, and Sharon just looked at me, my wife, and just laughed, because she could see the behavior that I might have when I get grumpy now. Yeah. And there it was in front of me as a 5-year-old. And I remember watching that and thinking, oh my God, as much as I might have done all of this work on myself, that little behavior is still there, and there I am feeling like that 5-year-old when it happens.
Yeah.
And it plays out through this thing.
Well, that's right. It plays out through your body.
Yeah.
And but I think the interesting thing and the difficult thing sometimes is to recognize those things in ourselves, which we do. We have physical and emotional behaviors that we act out from childhood, and maybe modify them over time, hopefully make them less unhelpful.
Mm.
But then to recognize that other people don't act out in the same way, they have very different responses and repertoires. We don't all respond to the same things, and you're dealing with different people all the time, and that you have to have a lot of time and patience to wait to have any kind of chance to see something different in somebody, rather than impress your own views. And I'm not even sure. In fact, I was listening to a podcast this morning, and they were talking about the difference between empathy and compassion. And it was quite a subtle conversation, but the conversation went something like this: that the idea of empathy, trying to understand how another person feels. This anthropologist had been in Papua New Guinea working with these kind of ideas in hunter-gatherer tribes. I feel sorry for all these tribes in Papua New Guinea with all these anthropologists constantly studying them. They must be pissed off with it. But they were outraged at the idea that anybody could begin to suggest they know how they felt. Once my dogs come to visit. They saw empathy as almost an insult. What they were saying is, you can have compassion for my situation. That's fine, but don't try and pretend you know how I feel, because you don't. And I think it really struck me as a kind of subtle but very interesting difference. And I'm trying to mute myself from saying I know how you feel, because I don't. I can say, I sympathize with your situation. That's valid, but I don't know how you feel. I might, because, even if you're talking about the loss of someone you love, you may have both lost a father or something like that, or a close friend, and you may think you know how they feel, but the responses could be very, very different. Yeah. So I think these are kind of interesting qualitative what a psychologist I'm reading around at the moment, Lisa Feldman-Barrett, talks about emotional granularity, the ability to distinguish feelings in a more fine-grained way. And that the better we do that, the better a handle we have on life, and the less granulated we are, I'm either angry or I'm sad, rather than all the nuanced feelings that we can have in between. And it's the same, in a sense, with our bodies, isn't it? I was talking to a group the other day, and we were doing something like Uddiyana Bandha. We were doing that kind of a movement, and how difficult they found it till their tummy muscles were being stretched or working. That was a difficult differentiation of sensation for them. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was interesting. That stretching a hamstring has a particular feeling to it, and it can feel a bit like a muscle working. It doesn't to me anymore, because I spent, like you, probably years and years and years distinguishing those feelings. But if we can't distinguish them, if they feel the same, if our emotions feel the same, if our sensations feel the same, we have a less nuanced way of responding to the world. Mm. And that in itself becomes problematic. So for me, where I am at the moment is at a place where I'm interested in helping people differentiate or granulate their experiences, their sensory experiences of the world, both on a physical and emotional level. And I find that very interesting work. Mm. It's a long way from osteopathy.
No, exactly. But it's interesting though, because when you consider, say, from what I've understood, as say maybe some of the origins of osteopathy, somewhere where maybe AT still might have been coming from. And if you could almost plot a route from where he would have gone, and if the osteopathy hadn't gone through some of the rigmarole that it has gone through, it's probably going to end up somewhere in the place that you're talking about.
Well, he was certainly more, I mean, it's a long time since I studied him actually, but I think he was clearly a much more holistic thinking man than the kind of osteopathy that I was studying in the 80s and 90s had become, which had really reduced people down into joints and bones and nerves. Yeah. And you know, displacement of joints and trapping of nerves, and that was why anybody had any pain, and all he had to do was free a nerve or replace the bone, and everyone was, you know, it's like the old argument of getting the frame right and people will be out of pain. Well, it's just bollocks, you know. It doesn't work.
Yeah. But so, you know, in terms of your movement, well, two things: your movement practice, because you know you have your own personal practice, and then your teaching.
Yeah.
You know, given that there's this philosophy, because it's almost like it's like a philosophy of movement, but that philosophy of movement goes into life, but then life is coming back into that philosophy of movement. So we kind of got this.
There's no separation.
And so, do you find that then that's where your practice exists in trying to get that information out there? I mean, you know, what if I said to you, Pete, you know, what's your purpose in teaching now? Why are you teaching?
I think, you know, to help with, I think, a current paradigm shift away from the belief that our problems are in our structure to an understanding that our beliefs are inappropriate responses to sensation. I don't want to use the word inappropriate because at some point they were appropriate, but in the lack of modifying our responses as things change. So, you know, you talked about seeing a video of yourself when you were 6 and I don't know, you know, you had a frowny face or whatever it was that you recognized, or which was your 6-year-old's response to whatever misdemeanor had happened, which might have been really appropriate for a 6-year-old. And then, of course, if we don't modify our behaviors and we still act like a 6-year-old when we're 55, whatever we are, you know, it's no longer appropriate. So, but it's very hard to change some behaviors that have become habituated, and they become unseen, of course. We find it difficult to notice them in ourselves. So, I mean, there's a lot of talk at the moment about things like, you know, the biases we have. I mean, the racial biases, it's a big theme at the moment, but cognitive biases aren't just about race, they're about almost every aspect of our being. So if we're going to change the world in any meaningful way, one of the things we have to help people do is to notice as the biases they have. And, you know, I'm talking about the bias of me having tense shoulders and not noticing it. You know, I remember the first time, I think it was Tom Myers pointed out I was holding tension in my back, and I was a bit offended because I was a yoga teacher, you know. Of course I haven't got tension in my back, I'm a yoga teacher. And you know, I had a kind of the pointing out of something I didn't know about myself. And most of us get a bit defensive when something is pointed out about us that we don't know about ourselves. So learning how to do that in a kind way to help people understand the unconscious things that get in the way of their lives, I think is a really helpful thing. I don't think it's helpful to shout at people and tell them they're stupid. Look at your stupid biases, don't you realize? Because all that does is make people even more defensive, and they put their fingers in their ears and stop listening. But there is something really, once you've got over the fact that we know we all are blind to certain aspects of our behavior, and if you can start to become curious rather than judgmental about, I wonder why that happened, you know. I mean, if you grew up in a racist family, it's not surprising you have a bias about race. If you grew up in a family that never did any exercise, you might have a bias about, I don't want to exercise, you know. You might have a resistance to wanting to do it because just of the culture that you you were shaped by,
Yeah,
sort of, we were
yeah,
shaped by history.
exactly. The other situations around you can then be an influence to actually maybe have you move outside of that, but it sometimes
Yeah,
requires a moment of stopping and looking at oneself and our own
yeah,
environment.
yeah.
And it's
And,
interesting with, sorry to interrupt, with the movement practice is that, we're creating an environment for things to happen in, and this internal environment is still responding, even though we might just be on a yoga mat.
yeah,
It's still an environment, and there's still
yeah.
a level of inquiry there, deeply.
And people, in a yoga class, you ask someone to do something, so I don't know, look up or turn to look over your right shoulder. So you give them a stimulus, something to do, and then what you become, or what I become interested in, is what do they bring to that intention. So you're trying to help people notice what are the unhelpful things they bring, um, and help them see it in a way that doesn't make them feel found out, uncomfortable. And you want to help them notice that will be the same in their relationships with their partners, with their children. They'll bring unhelpful things into the conversation, but they're just neurological repertoires that we've learnt and have kind of embodied as kids growing up. It's not our fault. It's just the way we were shaped by our past. And, we're shaped to fit the environment we grow up in. And if we change our environment, we might not fit anymore. And then we get symptoms. We feel unwell. And we might be unwell because we feel anxious, or we might get a back pain or a headache. And to help people notice the lack of fit, what do we need to change? What was the behavior that was appropriate then that is no longer appropriate and now makes me unwell? That's the kind of things I've become interested in. And it's often, I think if you jump in too deep too quickly, and I think this is a lot of the problem with the discussions that are going on around race and gender at the moment, you call people out too far downstream. What I really like about yoga is the first thing you might be able to point out to them is that pain in their knee isn't something to be frightened of. It's something to become curious about. What can I do with my painful knee? How can I work with this knee that's hurting me? The old story that it's pain and I should avoid moving it leads to more problems. You need to help people, first of all, to become less fearful about their knee, to start exploring what they can do with their knee, to change their attitude towards their knee. That's an easy way in, and then you find out with other things, I'm holding tension in my back. I realize I hold tension in my back. It's not because I was lifting things, it's because I had an argument with my husband or my wife. That's how I responded. I tightened my muscles because I was frightened or angry, and that gave me a pain in my back. And then, well, how do I change those responses? Those kind of things then become really helpful, because that's how you change. That's how it becomes, and then with less conflict. You're trying to find the friction in somebody's life on a physical or an emotional level that causes symptoms.
Yeah, it's almost as if the body calls you out, but over a slow period of time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Some people, they get called out too quickly by the body, and this is where we see the odd breakdown that happens or something like that. Know, you and I both know that somewhere in the practice, and I think it's something that Vanda Scaravelli had said in one of the interviews from Esther Myers, that lovely footage of her. We'll just grab you by the hair. Well, it can't do mine anymore. Yeah. By the hair and sort of pulls you up. It pulls you into place somewhere. And it's not about your posture, it's about something in your life. And everything just doesn't fit anymore. And you realize that I can't live that way, like that.
Yeah. And it can be quite a profound thing in yoga if you start to work with the body in a way where you slowly learn how to lose the unconscious tensions in your body. It's like you're dropping a history away, and you can feel a bit bewildered. It can feel bewildering.
It's a vulnerable place. I mean, you know, for me, I absolutely know that it was. I didn't let those things go easily. You know, they were sort of. I was hanging on to them. You know, it's but when they go, it's like, oh my God, why was I making such a fuss about hanging on to that?
Yeah, yeah. We still do it. I mean, I still do it. I'm constantly finding out about myself, all the things I'm still holding tight, you know.
Beautiful, isn't it? I mean, that's the endlessness of it, I think. It's
Yeah.
it just keeps unraveling. And, you know, the thing, and I say this to a lot of people that maybe, I mean, we've both seen this, is that some students will go at it very fast because they want it so quick.
Yeah.
And so, well, just, you know, slow down, just stay there. You can hang on to it. And if you want to stop for a while, you know, don't, you just hang out there. Remember, you and I have spoken about sometimes we do maintenance practice.
Yeah, yeah.
That's all there is time for. So all of the inquiry just might need to be parked for a few months or a year or more. And then all of a sudden it just calls you back in.
Usually you feel uncomfortable. Yeah. Something happens. I mean, I'm very aware that it doesn't matter if it's an emotional or a physical discomfort. I get on my mat and the whole thing starts to melt away after a while, because you start to lose the story in your body as you learn to, I don't know, support yourself through your skeleton, lose muscle tension, have a better relationship to gravity, under your breathing patterns. You just feel different.
Yeah.
So part of it is about learning how to discharge your history, and the other part is how to kind of remap yourself to fit the current environment. And I think one of the things there is about, you know, I mean, a very traditional yoga kind of method of putting a bit more space between stimulus and response. You know, those are, if you can do that, then you have a little bit of time not to just respond in a reflex way, and you can change your, you know, you may be able to change your responses.
That's a lovely way of describing it, actually, Pete. I like that very much. Just going back to something when you were saying, you know, yeah, getting on the floor, getting back onto the ground and experiencing the practice and that relationship to gravity is, and that took me straight to Vanda, because I just think she was probably experiencing the same things, but from her own understandings. And it was, the thing about it, it was just practical.
Yeah.
There was nothing that was just way out there with it. And you know, we've both had a strong influence from Mary Stewart. And I loved, and thank you for introducing people like Mary and Sophie and John to me. It was you that introduced them through your workshops you used to run in Stenning. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And it was, Mary was just so absolutely practical.
Yeah, she was. Yeah.
And I thank God for those teachings from you guys in those days, because it kept it away from just me getting a little bit too up there in the clouds with it, and it kept it on the ground. And
she was a very grounded woman, Mary, wasn't she?
Yeah, absolutely.
Quite cantankerous, but very grounded. Yeah.
And it's, you know, I think it was in so many ways, in terms of understanding the practicality of the practice, understanding the practicality and the nuances of being a teacher, and the responsibility of that too. You know, it was it's quite profound. And I think, yeah, absolutely. I think there's something that, I mean, as you know, I met Vanda, but only the once. And, you know, she was just very abrupt in her speaking. And the thing that she said to me, that you must never force your body. And she was looking at me because I was still coming from the muscular background, my bodybuilding background. And and I just said to her, well, why not? You know, there was a moment, because I was with Sophie, and Sophie pulled back as if you're not supposed to question Vanda. And I said, well, why not? And she just very straightforward said, because you hurt yourself, stupid. Yeah. And I just thought, oh, of course, that's it. Why don't I just back off a bit more?
Well, you know, it's an interesting, I mean, the other thing I'm teasing out in my classes, or I'm trying to tease out in my workshops more, is the difference between exercise and yoga. Because if you're exercising, if your intention is exercise, you might hurt yourself, because, you know, to change structure, if you want to build your muscles up or stretch a bit more or get more mobile or improve your cardio, you've got to load your tissues. And in loading them, you know, a lot of people hurt themselves. My son's just kind of getting into all that kind of stuff at the moment. He's trying to put on a bit of muscle, and it's kind of painful to watch, but it's a young man, and it's very understandable. But yeah, he comes down, and if it's not hurting, it's not good at the moment.
Pete, I'll teach him a methodology which will mix.
Yeah, I'll send him along. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but it's interesting though, isn't it? There is that sort of that fine line. So I remember when I first started coming to this practice, I was a bit, it caught me straight away. And as you know, I used to go to quite a few other yoga classes.
Yeah.
Trying to find my way, and it felt good. And then with my friend Gabby, you remember Gabby, we met you, we found you, and it was the only other practice. And I know that there was a lot more anatomy in it in those days, but it spoke to me in such a way that made sense of my own body.
Sure.
I've been taught to learn to train my system of training, and taught by other teachers to me in the bodybuilding, which the language was so similar. It's just that the medium was different.
Yeah, yeah.
They blended beautifully, and it's stayed that way ever since. And I think the profound quality of language can generate such an effect.
Yeah.
On someone.
I think, isn't it funny? I remember many years ago John talking about language, and me kind of missing the point. Thinking a whole workshop, and he was talking about language. I was a bit bored. I wanted to do some yoga. And now I think language is really important. And, in the sense that we haven't got a very good language for sensory experience. We've got a big language for doing, but not much for feeling. And I'm really working on that, trying to improve my language for sensory experience. Even emotional feelings, it's no good just the kind of Hulk smash response to sensation. There is quite a strong argument these days in some fields of psychology that argues that the more nuanced we are in our capacity to notice what our feelings represent, the less likely we are to feel depressed or anxious or worried by life. And I'm kind of pursuing that a bit because it echoes very much what I've been thinking about with the body. I think people don't have a very good sensory lexicon in terms of their physical experience. You must come across this. I love it when people try and describe their pain.
Yeah, really. This is interesting you say that, actually. I'm just thinking then as you say that. I mean, as you know, Sharon, my wife's from Brazil.
Yeah.
So, of course, she's English and Brazilian, her language from birth.
Yeah.
And there's certain words in Brazilian Portuguese that we just do not have in English.
Yeah, yeah.
When I see her and her daughter describe certain things, I say, well, what's that mean? And they describe it as a feeling. And the word describes a feeling and sensation that we don't have a word for. And when they say it and they try to describe everything around what it might mean, I get it completely.
Well, yeah.
No English word for it.
I mean, a good example of that is Schadenfreude, the German word for enjoying somebody else's discomfort. We have to borrow that from the Germans because we haven't got a word for it. I think there's a Buddhist word for enjoying somebody else's success. I can't remember the word, but if there's any Buddhists listening, I'm sure they'll know it. And I think, when you have a richer language for the expression of how you feel, you actually can feel more richly, and I think I was going to just make the comparison between, I remember listening to a program about underprivileged people having a poorer language for things like clothing, tops and bottoms, and how rather than, shirts and jumpers and, cardigans, it's just tops and bottoms, and how the paucity of language, I can't quite remember what the argument was, but it had a detrimental effect on their sense of well-being. And that was just an example of it. But I think with sensory experience, a paucity of language disenables us to express ourselves clearly enough, you know. If I want to tell you how I'm feeling and I can only say I feel happy or sad, it doesn't really give you an awful lot of to work on. But if I can nuance it, if I can say, yeah, I don't know, I feel a bit worried about the future, but I'm also excited by some aspects of it. You know, a little bit of fear in there. You kind of, there's a lot of flavors to some feelings that you have that aren't just good or bad.
Yeah,
And
that's so true. I mean, again, I keep going back to the Brazil thing purely because it's direct in my family. But when I'm out there in Rio and I meet a lot of Sharon's friends, they are so self-expressed. So their mannerism is self-expressed as well. Now, some of it's Latino and can go quite far, but it's
yeah,
a self-expression. And what it does, even if it has agitation to it, it burns off really quickly because it's fully expressed.
yeah, yeah, doesn't get caught up in the body.
It's interesting because our dog was with Sharon and one of her friends, and they were talking, and they're both Brazilian, and they're talking at home, and Honey, our dog, started pouring at them because there's these voices going to different pitches, and then her friend looked at Honey and said, "It's okay, Honey, we're just Brazilian."
Yeah.
And it was purely because they were being expressive. There was nothing agitating in the system at all. Honey's never really heard that pitch.
No, yeah. So she was trying to figure it out. What's going on here?
My dog is just quintessentially English.
Yes, it's going to slip up a lip.
That's so true, because I was taking a taxi drive last year when I was doing this thing in Germany, and there was a guy that was driving me to Gatwick.
Yeah.
He was a Middle Eastern taxi driver, and we were just chatting. He loves talking and finding out about the people he's driving. And we just got onto the language thing. And he said, in our culture, we have another 1,000 words that you don't even have in existence in the English language.
Yeah.
So we describe so many things in such a different way that almost like the Western dialect got no idea what it is completely, and they can describe things in such an expressive way.
Well, and it's no wonder then that we misunderstand people sometimes. And you take that cross-culturally, but that can happen between families in the same culture. You know, you grow up with expressions and ways of thinking about the world. So it's so easy to misunderstand and misread people, and that's why I'm very keen these days on, well, you know, listening or trying to get a sense of where people are coming from, trying to really understand more the framing of how they see the world and what their history has, how their history has shaped them, rather than fill it with my own projections, you know, which I was very good at and probably still do. But it, you know, it just gets in the way.
So Pete, couple of things here before we'll have to wrap up. But what got you interested in even exploring the yoga route in the first place? I mean, I know a lot of these things behind this. We've spoken many years back.
Yeah.
What really got you there?
Well, I mean, right at the beginning, you know, as a kind of rather lost teenager, it was a friend of mine. Yeah, I don't know if you ever met Mike Barnes. Yeah, well, you know, he went to India and did the whole hippie thing, you know, spent time with the Kampati yogis, you know, smoking loads of. And he came back with all these magical stories, you know. And I think I was looking for magic because, you know, in the 70s, the world was a bit grim. You know, we were in the miners' strike and 3-day weeks, and it's a bit like it is now, actually. I was reflecting on that the other day. The kind of mid-70s is a very similar, rather bleak outlook that we've got now. And magic in yoga represented, in those days, yoga was much more exotic. You know, there was the Maharishi Mahesh, the Beatles had been all into it. There was a kind of mystique around it that was very seductive to a young man who was a bit fed up with, I didn't want to be a bank manager, you know. So I started practicing yoga for that reason. And I suppose the odd thing is, of course, I didn't find any magic in that kind of sense that I wanted to. But I bumped into my body because I was also a very disembodied young man because I'm fairly dyspraxic. I'm not a natural, I'm not a natural athlete, gymnast, dancer. I've never done any, exercise at school. But doing yoga where I didn't have to follow people's instructions, there's no choreography to it apart from, you know. And all that kind of stretching that I did in the anger system was actually probably a good introduction for me. I bumped into something there and I felt myself for the first time. And that kept me going and got me very interested in bodies, which got me into osteopathy, which got me very into structure and anatomy, which I found really fascinating. And touching people in that kind of therapeutic way, I think was very good for me. And I was a much better physical therapist than I was a carpenter, which was my job at the time, which I was just barely adequate at. And in a way, both yoga and osteopathy were the first two things I felt valued in, So it gave me some sense of self-worth, self-esteem, which is important in life. But more than anything, I think it triggered a curiosity in me that, I've always been my problem in life is I'm a daydreamer. I can't, and I'm hopeless at following orders.
Fellow Libra.
Yeah. So if you're a daydreamer who can't follow orders, you've got to find your own way in life. And I just meandered. Every time I get caught up in a system, in an organization, I find myself just drifting to the edges of it and skirting around the corners and standing in the cracks of the pavement rather than on the pavement. It just seems to be the territory I feel most at ease in. And so I just found my own way, in a way, with other people a bit like me, I think. John, I think, is a bit like me in that sense. I think Vanda probably was, Grakovetsky was. I see strengths and weaknesses in that kind of approach. I think the strengths are that you can think outside the box, and I've always liked people who can think, and they're not just people who have wild random thoughts, but people who can put different strands of thinking together in a very coherent way and make use of them. And I like that. I think that's a real strength of that way of being. The weakness is I'm not a very good team player, and I wish I was a better team player. If I'm in a team, I very quickly want to be out of the team, or I find a way of getting out of the team. So I try and work on that. I try and become a better team player. But
you find that in terms of being team player, then I know you've got your studio, which I remember when you started to open that, and that was I remember thinking, oh, yes, Pete's got his own studio now, and that was such a great thing for it to have in the world, really. But do you find that there's a team element with that at all, or is it set up?
I've probably got. Well, I was going to say I probably have created a studio with not much of a team. But actually, the truth is, over the years, of course, you develop a team ethos. Everyone who comes there thinks in the same way. We all teach a similar kind of way. We all have similar beliefs around the way people should be and are in the world, how to work in yoga. So, of course, there is, and it's just not very cohesive. I'm not a team leader that's trying to knock everybody into my shape. And that's again a strength and a weakness. So people have a lot of autonomy; they can do what they like.
Yeah.
But I think some people would want me to take the reins a bit more and lead a bit more from the front. More of a leader from behind, if you like.
I think that's a great model to have. But as you, I get you on that one. I've been in a similar situation that I know sometimes when I had my centre, trying to sort of lead from the front, was
Yeah.
always a problem, but trying to create it from behind, actually, you could see that it was actually giving more empowerment to the individuals that were involved.
Yeah. I mean, well, I agree. I mean, I think that's the point. If you're interested in helping people develop and learn and grow, you want them to do all the work, really. You want that, and to be seen to and to take the credit for all their learning. I don't want to take credit for other people's learning.
Right.
It's all their hard work. And I don't mind being part of their process, walking along the walk with them and helping answer questions as they come up, as these people explore. And if I've been there and I have a useful answer, I can contribute. But I'm very wary of setting oneself up as an authority, just simply because I know my mind's changed constantly.
Yeah.
If anyone started to quote me, in 10 years' time, that quote would be redundant. So we're on a journey together, holding each other's hand.
It was actually, lovely to see you go through that journey of change in yourself again, coming back to that, where, you've been through a particular method within your practice. And a lot of us were there in that process where you were changing and seeing the change in your teaching and how you were teaching. And the students as well were changing to some degree. Some were staying with you. And then,
I think what's really rewarding is to see all those people we talked about earlier, you, Liz, Nev, Faye, Lisa, how you've all gone off in your own different directions, and it's just great.
And we're all still teaching, so thank you for that. It's and that is it was very astute, I think, of you, whether you knew it or not. To sort of finding those people and putting them together. It was just something I think just it happened organically anyway.
Yeah.
I always remember with fondness the Thursday evenings we used to have, either in that place in St. John Street, and then we transferred it to Jew Street. And the hours of explorative practice and just seeing where it took us, and as crazy as it got sometimes, it was, but we all sort of trusted in the fact that and you would say this, I think something that Sabina probably said to you at some point about creating an environment for learning.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that would be a very Sabine quote. That we're not teaching, we're creating an environment for learning. I think that's very true.
And it's it's been that's always stayed with me. That whenever I'm going back into a space, how do I create an environment for learning? It happened there. That was, and I think each one of us have got that still inside us. When I'm teaching, and I'll say this in my courses because you're quoted a lot, John's quoted a lot, Sophie and Mary and so on, and Diane too, is that although teachers are in the room with me,
of course,
it's all that happens is just sort of piecing together the jigsaw puzzles of those teachers and everything else and my life experience.
All the stuff you and what we do, we integrate all the people who've influenced us. We integrate them, we put it out, and then you can't, in a sense, you can't take any one person, can you? Because we're all amalgam of all the teachers that we had. I can think of all the lecturers who lectured me at osteopathic college, all the yoga teachers I've had in the past, all the mentors I've had, and you synthesize it. So it's like a continuum of historians of giants. I like that to help us get a better view. I really like the idea that we're lifted up by the people who went before us, so we can see a little bit further.
Well, I think
hopefully we lift other people up.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. And on that note, Pete, I think that's a good place to leave it. That's a great place to stop there. If people need to find you, Pete, how do they find you? Probably
at the moment, my Intelligent Yoga website is the best one. So intelligentyoga.co.uk. That's where most of my stuff is these days.
Thank you.
Nice to talk, Gary.
Real pleasure.
Yeah. All right.